The sky was a murky gray, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Inside the Tower of London, a woman, old and frail, waited for her fate. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, had been held prisoner for 3 long years. At 67, she had lived a life that spanned the glory of the Tudor court and the bitter betrayals that followed. Now she stood in the cold, damp courtyard, her hands trembling but her eyes resolute. When the sentence of death was read to her, Margaret was bewildered. She had no idea what crime she had committed. But as the reality sank in, she accepted her fate with dignity. She walked toward the small block, where no scaffold had been erected. There she knelt and commended her soul to God. She asked those present to pray for the king, queen, prince, and princess, and she sent her blessings, especially to Princess Mary, whom she had once nurtured and loved. The executioner, a young and inexperienced man, stepped forward. The usual executioner was busy in the north, dealing with rebels. This one had never performed such a task before. The crowd watched in horror as he swung his axe, but he missed. Again and again he struck, each blow more clumsy than the last. Margaret's final moments were a grotesque, bloody mess. The court was stunned, and the King Henry VIII was unperturbed. His mind was already on new ventures. As the news of Margaret Pole's execution spread, the court's attention turned to the festive season. Christmas 1540 was a time of joy and celebration, but it was also a time of tension. Henry VIII, the powerful and unpredictable king, had a new wife, Katherine Howard. She was young, beautiful, and inexperienced, and the court was abuzz with speculation about her fate. The king's previous wife, Anne of Cleves, had been discarded, but she had shown remarkable grace. Anne had accepted her role as Henry's sister with dignity, sending thoughtful gifts to the king and queen. On January 3, 1541, Anne visited Hampton Court, bringing with her 2 fine horses caparisoned in mauve velvet. Her presence was a reminder of the past, but her behavior was a model of humility and goodwill. When Anne entered the room, she approached Catherine with the utmost reverence, kneeling before her and speaking with the utmost respect. Catherine, in turn, received her with warmth and kindness. Henry, pleased by the display of affection, joined them and rewarded Anne with a New Year's kiss. The evening was filled with music, dancing, and laughter, but beneath the surface, the Howard faction, Catherine's family, was on edge. They knew that their young and innocent relative needed constant guidance and protection. Eustace Chapuys, the Spanish ambassador, was a keen observer of the court. He had been in England for years, reporting to Emperor Charles V, and he had seen the rise and fall of many of Henry's wives. Chapuys was impressed by Anne's intelligent charm and her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. He noted that she had sent gifts to both the king and queen, smoothing over any potential tension. As the night wore on, Henry retired to his chambers, leaving Catherine and Anne to enjoy the festivities. They danced together, first as a pair, then separately with the king's gentlemen. Chapuys watched as they moved with grace and ease, their laughter and conversation a stark contrast to the dark events of the day. The next day, the 3 of them dined together, and the merriment continued. Chapuys reported to Charles V that the king and queen were delighted with Anne's behavior. Henry, always the master of manipulation, had wanted the meeting to go well, and he was pleased with the outcome. Katherine Howard was young and naive, but she was not without her strengths. Chapuys noted that she had a desire for harmony and a good relationship with Anne. When Henry sent her a ring and 2 small dogs as a New Year's gift, Catherine passed them on to Anne, either in her own name or in the king's. Henry had also given Anne an annual rent of 1,000 ducats, a clear sign of his gratitude. Catherine's first real test came a few months later, during her inauguration festivities. She and Henry shared a royal barge as they progressed from Greenwich, and the people of London greeted her with enthusiasm. But Catherine was more than a figurehead. She showed her political acumen by pleading for the release of Thomas Wyatt, a prisoner in the Tower. Wyatt was a reformist and had been separated from his wife for 15 years. Henry granted her request, but on strict conditions. Catherine then asked for the release of John Wallop, a conservative with ties to her family. Henry, unable to refuse his new wife, granted her wish. Despite her success, Catherine struggled with one relationship, her stepdaughter, Princess Mary. Mary, 5 years older than Catherine, was a strong-willed and pious woman. She had a deep devotion to her father, but found it difficult to accept his new wife. Mary snubbed Catherine, treating her with less respect than her previous stepmothers. Catherine, feeling slighted, threatened to remove 2 of Mary's trusted maids. Mary, heeding Chapuys' warning, reluctantly made an effort to ingratiate herself. Chapuys, ever the diplomat, was concerned about the relationship between Catherine and Mary. He noted that Mary's absence from court during Catherine's first Christmas was a bad sign, but he was relieved when Catherine sent gifts to both Henry and Mary, which were well received. By May 1541, things seemed to be improving. Catherine and Mary visited the young Prince Edward, and Henry invited Mary to reside permanently at court. Catherine, it seemed, was determined to bury the hatchet and move forward. The court was in a state of cautious optimism, but the underlying tensions were far from resolved. Chapuys, meanwhile, was facing his own challenges. Charles V, the emperor, had stopped paying his ambassador, and Chapuys was struggling financially. He wrote to Charles, pleading for his arrears and more money to cover the costs of his duties. Despite his financial troubles, Chapuys continued to gather intelligence and report on the court's activities. The court was a place of constant intrigue and shifting alliances, and Chapuys was at the center of it all. He watched as Katherine Howard, the young and inexperienced queen, navigated the treacherous waters of court politics. The future was uncertain, but for now, the court was enjoying a rare moment of peace. Henry had put off his usual trip to the north after the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, but to everyone's surprise, he decided to go ahead with it in the summer. Henry and his new wife, Catherine, set out with a grand group of people, braving the rainy weather as they traveled north. Several ambassadors, including de Marillac, joined the court, but Chapuys stayed behind in London because of his gout and other health issues. Chapuys, however, had a clever plan. He had turned de Marillac's trusted secretary, Jehan Hans, into his own spy. Hans provided Chapuys with important information throughout 1541 and 1542, even giving him the ciphers used by King Francis and his ministers to write to their ambassadors. Chapuys sent copies of these letters to Charles the Emperor and kept him updated on Henry's progress. Chapuys was very careful with the information Hans gave him. He sifted through it before sending anything to Charles, and he praised Hans for his skills. Hans eventually left the French service and went to work for Mary of Hungary, carrying a letter of recommendation from Chapuys. After Henry and Catherine returned from their trip, the court was busy with diplomatic talks. De Marillac tried to get Henry to ally with France by proposing a marriage between Lady Mary and the Duke of Orleans. Chapuys did everything he could to stop this, as he found the idea of Mary marrying into the French royal family deeply troubling. Hans was a valuable source of information, but he was also expensive. Chapuys had to pay him well to get full reports. In November, Chapuys was caught off guard by news that Henry and Catherine were having problems. Months earlier, he had reported that Henry had pretended to be sick and avoided Catherine for a while, and there had been talk of a divorce, but that seemed to have been resolved. Now, Henry had suddenly left Catherine at Hampton Court and taken only a few attendants with him. Chapuys learned that an investigation had started because a servant named Mary Lascelles had told her brother some disturbing things about Catherine's past. The brother then told Thomas Cranmer. It turned out that Catherine was not as innocent as Henry had believed. Chapuys discovered that Catherine's usher, Francis Dereham, had been sent to the Tower. At first, he thought Henry was using the same excuse he always used to get out of a marriage, a pre-contract, but the story got more complicated. Catherine had confessed to having a relationship with Dereham before her marriage to Henry, and it was also discovered that she had met with a man named Thomas Culpeper in secret. Jane Rochford, who had been lady-in-waiting to Catherine, had helped the lovers meet. Chapuys was shocked and asked Henry's counselors how Henry planned to handle the situation. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, was furious and wanted her to be burned alive. Chapuys hoped she would be sent to a nunnery instead. Culpeper and Dereham were tried for treason, and all the foreign embassies were invited to attend. Dereham confessed to having a relationship with Catherine before her marriage, but Culpeper denied any sexual involvement, saying Catherine had approached him through Jane Rochford. Both men were found guilty, and sentenced to death. Jane Rochford was also to be tried, but she was declared insane and was not executed right away. Henry, however, sent his own doctors to help her recover so she could be executed. Catherine was kept at Sion House, where she seemed to be in good spirits, but Chapuys noted that she was more demanding than ever. He thought Henry might show her some mercy, especially since he had no new wife lined up. But Henry began showing interest in other women, and Chapuys reported that he was already wining and dining them. In January 1542, Catherine was taken to the Tower. She asked to see the execution block and practiced placing her head on it. Chapuys reported that she seemed to want to do everything right, even in death. Jane Rochford was also executed, and Henry quickly passed a law to ensure that anyone who knew about a woman's past misconduct had to reveal it within 20 days or face severe punishment. With Catherine gone, Henry was in high spirits and hosted many feasts and banquets. Chapuys noted that Henry was now a man without a queen, and it seemed he was happy about it. Charles asked Chapuys if Henry might marry again, but the court was more focused on the ongoing diplomatic tensions between England, France, and the Empire. Chapuys, who was looking to retire, continued to navigate these complex relationships, while de Marillac struggled to achieve his goals. Chapuys, the imperial ambassador to England, was feeling the strain of his role. He had been working tirelessly to negotiate an alliance between Emperor Charles V and King Henry VIII, but progress was slow. The negotiations were complicated by a lack of funds promised by Charles and the stalled talks between the two monarchs. Chapuys felt he was no longer the right person for the job and requested to be recalled. However, Charles insisted he stay, promising to send Philip de Montmorency to assist him. During the early months of 1542, King Henry was in a deep funk, grieving over the arrest and execution of his former queen, Katherine Howard. Chapuys noticed that Henry was often sad and dejected, sighing frequently. But as spring arrived, the king began to emerge from his despondency. Chapuys resumed his formal meetings with Henry, hoping to revive the talks about an alliance. Chapuys tried a new approach with Henry, one that was more personal and less formal. He promised to keep Henry's confidences, and even offered to present Henry's ideas to Charles, as if they were his own. This seemed to work. Henry's face lit up, and he appeared more willing to listen. Chapuys also cultivated a good relationship with Henry's key counselors, William Fitzwilliam and Thomas Wriothesley, who favored an alliance with the emperor. However, Chapuys still lacked the official authority to promise anything concrete. This made his position difficult, as Henry suspected that Mary of Hungary was pressuring Chapuys to delay negotiations. Despite these challenges, Chapuys remained determined to move forward. He suggested that Henry make the first move, not knowing that Henry had already done so by requesting military provisions from Charles. When the official instructions from Charles finally arrived, Chapuys was elated. The letters officially appointed him as the emperor's representative to negotiate a treaty of friendship and alliance with Henry. This boosted Chapuys' standing at court, and even the French ambassador de Marillac noticed that Chapuys was being favored over him. Chapuys' personal concern for Princess Mary, Henry's daughter, also continued to grow. He frequently wrote to her, offering comfort and advice. Mary was often unwell and under stress, and Chapuys' letters provided her with much-needed support. Their correspondence deepened their bond, and Mary wrote back warmly, expressing her gratitude. As summer approached, Chapuys worked tirelessly to secure the alliance. He dined often with Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, who shared valuable insights into court politics. Gardiner's information was crucial in helping Chapuys understand Henry's true intentions. In late December, Princess Mary returned to court for the Christmas festivities. Her relationship with her father had improved, and she became Chapuys' most valuable informant. Mary reported back to Chapuys about the French ambassador's activities and even overheard Henry threatening France if they caused any trouble in Scotland. Chapuys' efforts were finally paying off. De Granvelle, Charles' chief minister, praised Chapuys for his hard work and urged him to persevere despite his health issues. Mary of Hungary also trusted Chapuys' judgment and asked him to continue working on the alliance without pushing Henry too hard. Despite the challenges, Chapuys remained committed to his mission. He knew that securing an alliance with Henry was crucial for the emperor's cause, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the personal cost. Eustace Chapuys, the imperial ambassador to the court of King Henry VIII, found himself in a tricky position. Even as he was on the brink of a significant diplomatic achievement, he was torn between his duties in Flanders and the need to support the growing alliance between Emperor Charles V and King Henry. The emperor's affairs were in good order, and Charles was pleased with the progress, but Chapuys knew that maintaining this delicate balance required constant attention. Chapuys' friend, Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, reassured him that the French were widely despised, especially King Francis I, who was seen as a traitor. De Granvelle urged Chapuys to act quickly, as the time was ripe to strengthen the alliance against the common enemy. However, Chapuys faced a challenge at the English court, where Henry's courtier, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, showed sympathy for France and an interest in the controversial ideas of Martin Luther. This made Chapuys wary, as he feared Surrey's influence could undermine their plans. Despite these obstacles, Chapuys managed to draft a treaty that Charles and Mary of Hungary, the emperor's sister, approved. Charles was so impressed with Chapuys' work that he immediately signed the document and sent a letter of commendation, expressing his full confidence in the ambassador. This was a significant victory for Chapuys, who had faced many setbacks in his long career. Chapuys knew that to keep Henry engaged, he had to play to the king's sense of historical greatness. Henry, who had yet to achieve a glorious victory like those of his ancestors, was eager to prove himself. Chapuys encouraged Henry to focus on military campaigns, particularly an attack on France. They discussed battle strategies, and Henry proposed a plan to attack Champagne, which would lead to a direct assault on Paris. Meanwhile, Henry's troops would target key French cities like Boulogne and Rouen. The departure of Thomas Seymour, a prominent courtier, further strengthened the alliance. Chapuys had recommended Seymour for a position at Mary's court, and the two men had developed a good relationship. The treaty was ratified in May, marking the beginning of a war against France. However, Chapuys soon faced a new challenge when Mary of Hungary questioned whether he had made promises to Henry that he couldn't keep. Chapuys denied making any official suggestions, but admitted to offering personal advice. He believed Henry was simply stalling and not fully committed to the war. The prospect of war seemed to invigorate Henry, and he began to think about marriage again. Katherine Parr, Henry's sixth wife, appeared on the scene. Chapuys was more concerned with how this marriage would affect Mary, Henry's daughter, and hoped it would be the last. He wrote to Philip, Charles's son, to inform him of the marriage, emphasizing the importance of the king's affection for Mary. In 1543, a new ambassador, Thomas Perrenot de Granvelle, arrived in England. Chapuys, who had been in his position for nearly 14 years, took a keen interest in the young man's performance. Perrenot proved to be a capable diplomat, and Chapuys advised him on how to handle the English court. Chapuys' health, however, was deteriorating due to gout, making it difficult for him to write. Despite this, he continued to work, and Charles finally addressed his financial concerns by paying him a significant amount. Thomas Perrenot's mission also included asking Henry for a loan to support Charles's campaign against the Duke of Cleves. Chapuys, aware of the importance of this request, worked closely with Perrenot to ensure its success. The marriage between Henry and Katherine Parr caused tension with Anne of Cleves, which Chapuys used to his advantage. He reported that Anne was eager to leave England, and while he was concerned about Katherine's lack of children, he was pleased to see her good relationship with Mary. Henry mobilized his troops to fight the French, and Chapuys continued to push for a strong alliance. He reminded Charles that Henry needed to be constantly encouraged, and praised to stay engaged. However, Charles began to criticize Chapuys for his lack of detailed reports, suggesting that the ambassador was losing his touch. Despite this, Chapuys kept up the pressure on Henry, suggesting a campaign against the Duke of Holstein, who had ambitions in Scotland. In July 1544, Chapuys accompanied Henry to Calais, the starting point for the invasion of France. He hoped that from France, Charles might allow him to retire. However, Mary of Hungary insisted that he remain to keep Henry focused on the war. Chapuys learned that Francis had made peace overtures to Henry, and he quickly convinced the king that Francis was untrustworthy. Despite this, Chapuys suspected that Henry was stalling and might not have the resources to continue the war. Henry decided to press on, and Chapuys, pleading ill health, remained in Calais. Mary ordered him to follow Henry to Boulogne, and he had no choice but to comply. The journey was grueling, but Chapuys was determined to fulfill his mission. Charles sent additional support, and Chapuys found himself working closely with Antoine Perrenot, the son of his old friend Nicolas Perrenot de Granvelle. With the French still offering peace, Chapuys knew that his role was crucial in keeping Henry committed to the war. The cold winds of early spring swept through the gardens outside the palace as Chapuys, now an old and ailing man, sat in his chair carried by his loyal servants. He had come to say goodbye to a place and a people he had grown to care for deeply over the past 15 years. His mind wandered back to the days when he first arrived in England, a middle-aged ambassador full of vigor and determination, tasked with the mission to mend the strained relations between King Henry VIII and Emperor Charles V. Henry had granted him an audience for 10 o'clock, but Chapuys, eager to savor his last moments, arrived early. He spent the time in quiet reflection, gazing at the well-kept gardens opposite Queen Catherine Parr's apartments. The gardens were a symbol of the beauty and order that Catherine brought to the court, a stark contrast to the turmoil that often surrounded Henry. As he sat there, his servants informed him that Catherine and Mary had seen him and were hurrying to say farewell. The ambassador's heart warmed at the thought. Over the years, he had come to admire Catherine for her grace and intelligence, and he had grown especially close to Mary, seeing her as more than just a princess, but as a young woman who needed protection and guidance. Before he could rise from his chair, Catherine and a small retinue of ladies, including Mary, reached him. Chapuys, as much as his health allowed, showed the utmost respect to the queen. Catherine, with her warm and sincere smile, said she couldn't let him leave without seeing him personally. She spoke of his years of loyal service and the crucial role he played in maintaining the alliance between Charles and Henry. She expressed her hope that his health would improve once he returned to the continent, where he had longed to be for so long. Catherine then turned to the ambassador with a plea. She asked him to continue his efforts to keep the two empires aligned, emphasizing how important it was for the friendship between Charles and Henry to endure and even grow stronger. Chapuys, moved by her words, promised to do his best. He could not have imagined a more perfect wife for Henry than Catherine. After a few more kind words, Catherine and her ladies stepped back, giving Chapuys and Mary a moment of privacy. Mary, always the lady, stepped forward hesitantly. Over the years, Chapuys had fought for her, admired her, and considered himself her protector. He had hoped to say more, to impart some final wisdom or reassurance, but he could see that Mary was reluctant to prolong the meeting. She was concerned about his comfort, knowing how much pain he was in from his gout. In that brief moment, Chapuys felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had done everything he could to protect Mary and to secure her future. As he watched her step back to rejoin the queen, he knew that she would be in good hands. Catherine had shown herself to be a capable and caring stepmother, and Mary would continue to thrive under her guidance. The ambassador's final audience with King Henry was brief but significant. Henry, still proud and sometimes volatile, had a grudging respect for Chapuys. The two men, despite their differences, had a history that went beyond mere political alliances. Chapuys delivered his final message from Charles, emphasizing the need for peace and understanding between the two monarchs. Henry, though still stubborn, seemed to listen with a more open mind. As Chapuys prepared to leave England, he carried with him the memories of a long and eventful mission. He had seen the highs and lows of court politics, the shifting alliances, and the personal dramas that defined the era. But most of all, he carried the knowledge that he had made a difference, not just in the world of diplomacy, but in the lives of the people he had come to care for deeply. Chapuys returned to the continent, where he was granted a pension from the Abbey of St. Angelo of Brolo in Sicily. He spent his remaining years in relative peace, reflecting on the years he spent in England and the friendships he had formed. Even though he was no longer an ambassador, his influence continued to be felt. The alliances he had helped to build and the relationships he had nurtured would shape the future of Europe for years to come. In the end, Chapuys left behind a legacy of loyalty, diplomacy, and a deep commitment to the people he served. His story was one of duty, honor, and the enduring power of friendship.